I met Toon in graduate school when I was 24 and he was 26. We were both in the communications program, and honestly, he caught my attention because he was so different from the other guys I dated. While everyone else was out partying or trying to impress professors with loud opinions, Toon practically lived in the library. He had this quiet, focused energy that I found incredibly attractive. There was something solid about him, something reliable. Our first real conversation happened during a group study session. I was struggling with this theoretical framework for my thesis, and while the other students were throwing around buzzwords they clearly didn't understand, Tun just quietly explained the concept in a way that actually made sense. He was a good listener, really good. And he had this way of making you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. After that, I started suggesting we study together more often. The transition from study partners to something more happened gradually. Toon was working on his thesis research while also holding down a part-time job, so he didn't have a lot of free time. But when we were together, I had his complete attention. He wasn't constantly checking his phone or looking around to see who else was in the room. When Toon looked at you, he really saw you. It was refreshing. Honestly, I'd gotten so used to guys who were always half-focused on something else. 6 months into dating, I brought him home to meet my parents. My dad, Richard, had pretty strong opinions about the men I dated. And my mom was always worried about financial stability and long-term prospects. But Toon made an excellent impression. He was respectful, articulate about his academic work, and clearly had solid career prospects ahead of him. My parents loved him immediately. "She seems like a keeper," his mom told him later, and honestly, hearing that felt amazing. There's something validating about knowing your partner's family approves of you, like you've passed some important test. When we moved in together at the 1.5 year mark, it felt like the natural next step. Toon had this nice condo, and I was getting tired of my cramped apartment with roommates who never cleaned up after themselves. Living with Tun was easy. He was neat without being obsessive. He cooked better than I did, and he never complained when I took over the bathroom counter with my skincare routine. We fell into this comfortable rhythm where he'd work on his thesis in the evenings while I caught up on my own coursework, and we'd reconnect over dinner or late-night conversations. The proposal came at the 2.5 year mark, and I have to admit, Toon did it right. He'd clearly put thought into it. And the ring was gorgeous. Definitely more expensive than I'd expected him to spend. When he got down on one knee in our living room and asked me to marry him, I felt this rush of pure happiness. This was it. This was my future, laid out perfectly in front of me. We were going to be one of those couples who made it work, who built something lasting together. Wedding planning started immediately, and that's when things began to get complicated. Both sets of parents had strong opinions about everything. The venue, the guest list, the budget, the timeline. My dad was particularly invested in making sure everything looked perfect. And Toon's parents had their own ideas about what constituted appropriate spending. Suddenly, what should have been our wedding became this massive collaborative project with way too many stakeholders. I started staying late at work more often during this period, partly because wedding planning was overwhelming and partly because work was one place where I could just be myself without having to consider everyone else's opinions about napkin colors and seating arrangements. That's when I really started talking to Blake, and he was a coworker who'd always been friendly. But during those late evenings when most people had gone home, we began having these great conversations about work, about life, about everything, really. Blake was funny in a way that Tun wasn't. Not that Tun didn't have a sense of humor, but his was more gentle and understated, and Blake was quick and sharp, and he could make me laugh until my sides hurt. He also seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts about things beyond wedding planning and domestic logistics. When I talked to Blake, I felt like the interesting, dynamic person I'd been before my entire identity became Toon's fiancé and the bride-to-be. I started looking forward to those late work sessions. And then Blake and I began grabbing drinks afterward sometimes, just as friends, just to decompress from work stress. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't something else building between us. He had this way of looking at me that made me feel attractive and desirable in a way I hadn't felt in a while. When you've been with someone for several years, you can start to feel invisible sometimes, like you're just part of the furniture. Blake made me feel seen again. The first time we kissed, it was after one of those work happy hours. We were walking to our cars, and he made some joke that had me laughing. And then suddenly we were standing very close together and it just happened. It wasn't planned. And honestly, it felt more real and spontaneous than anything that had happened between Toon and me in months. I drove home that night feeling guilty, but also more alive than I'd felt in ages. I told myself it was just a one-time thing, just a moment of weakness brought on by wedding stress and too many drinks. But then it happened again a few weeks later, and then we started texting more regularly. Nothing too explicit, but definitely more personal than typical coworker communication. I found myself complaining to Blake about things that were bothering me. Tun's tendency to just nod and agree with whatever I said instead of having actual opinions. The way he'd gotten so absorbed in his thesis work that he barely seemed to notice when I was in the room. How he treated our relationship like another item on his to-do list that he could check off and then move on to the next task. Blake understood my frustrations in a way that felt validating. He'd point out how I deserved someone who was fully present and engaged. Someone who appreciated my intelligence and wit instead of just taking it for granted. When I was with Blake, I felt like the vibrant, interesting person I'd always seen myself as. When I was with Toon, I increasingly felt like I was playing a role. The supportive girlfriend, the perfect future wife, the woman who was grateful for stability and security, even if it came with a side of emotional numbness. The guilt was definitely there, but I rationalized it pretty effectively. Toon and I hadn't been intimate in weeks because he was so focused on finishing his thesis. He barely looked up from his laptop when I came home from work. When I tried to talk to him about anything beyond logistics, wedding planning, his research, my work schedule, he'd give me these distracted responses that made it clear he wasn't really listening. Was it really so terrible that I'd found someone who actually wanted to engage with me as a person? 6 months before our wedding date, I decided I needed to address this situation head on. I'd been reading about different relationship models, and the concept of open marriage kept coming up. There were all these articles about couples who'd found ways to stay committed to each other, while also acknowledging that monogamy wasn't necessarily natural or sustainable for everyone. It seemed like such a mature, progressive approach to long-term partnership. Why should we both have to suppress our natural desires and curiosities just because we'd decided to get married? On a Thursday evening, after Toon had finally closed his laptop and we were both sitting in the living room, I brought it up. Toon, what do you think about an open marriage? His response was immediate and dismissive. Yeah, that would be the fastest way to end one. I tried to explain what I'd been reading about, how some couples actually thrived with this kind of arrangement, how it could take pressure off the relationship and allow both people to explore different aspects of themselves. But Toon wasn't having any of it. He looked at me like I'd suggested we burn the house down for fun. So there's someone else, he said. And it wasn't really a question. No, there isn't, I said, which was technically true. Blake and I hadn't slept together or anything. We'd kissed a few times and had some intense conversations, but it wasn't like I was having some torrid affair. I'm just talking about this theoretically, as something we might consider, but Toon had this look on his face that I'd never seen before. Usually he was so easygoing, so willing to discuss things rationally. Now he looked almost cold. If you're serious about there being no one else, hand me your phone right now. Oh, come on. Toon, don't be ridiculous. The request felt so invasive, so controlling, This wasn't the man I'd agreed to marry. This was some jealous, possessive stranger, but he wasn't backing down. I'm completely serious. Mia, if there's nothing to hide, then there's no reason not to hand it over. I felt trapped. Yes, Blake and I had been texting, and yes, some of those texts were probably more intimate than they should have been. And yes, I might have complained about Tun to Blake more than I should have, but that didn't mean I was having an affair. That didn't mean I was some cheating monster who deserved this kind of treatment. But Tun was just sitting there with his hand out, waiting. And I realized that if I didn't give him the phone, he'd know for sure that I was hiding something. So I handed it over, my heart pounding. He scrolled through my contacts and found Blake's number, listed under B because I thought that was more discreet. Then he started reading through our text messages, and I watched his face change. The messages weren't explicitly sexual, but they were definitely flirtatious, and there were quite a few where I'd complained about Tun, called him boring, said I felt trapped in our relationship. It's not what it looks like, I said, but even I could hear how weak that sounded. Tun set the phone down and looked at me directly. Are you sleeping with him? No, I said. And that was true. Are you having an emotional affair with him? I swore up and down that I wasn't, that Blake was just a friend, that I'd been stressed about wedding planning and maybe I'd vented more than I should have, but that didn't mean anything significant was happening. But Tun wasn't buying it, and honestly, looking at those messages from his perspective, I could see why they looked bad. We're done, he said, with this strange calm that was somehow more terrifying than if he'd been yelling. The wedding is over. Then he got up and started packing my belongings. Just like that. No discussion. No negotiation. No opportunity for me to explain or apologize or work things out. He went to our bedroom and started pulling my clothes out of the closet and folding them into boxes. When I tried to argue with him, tried to tell him he was overreacting, he ignored me completely. You can't be serious. I kept saying, you're going to throw away 5 years over some text messages. You're going to call off our wedding because I had a few conversations with a coworker. But Tun just kept packing, methodical and thorough. It was like watching a stranger. This wasn't the man who'd been patient and understanding about everything for the past several years. This was someone I didn't recognize at all. When he finished packing, he carried the boxes out to my car and loaded them in. Some of our neighbors were outside and definitely noticed what was happening, which was humiliating. Then he went back inside and came out with the engagement ring I'd left on the bathroom counter. I'll be keeping this, he said. And then he went back into the house and closed the door. I sat in my car for probably 20 minutes, waiting for him to come back out, waiting for him to realize how extreme he was being. But the house stayed dark except for one light in his office, where he'd presumably gone back to work on his thesis like nothing had happened. The next day, I called him probably 20 times. I texted him long messages explaining my side of things, apologizing for the parts that I could acknowledge were mistakes, asking him to please just talk to me so we could work this out like adults. But he'd blocked my number. Every call went straight to voicemail, and none of my texts were getting delivered. 2 days later, I drove to his building and waited for him to come home from work. When he saw me in the lobby, he told me that if I didn't leave immediately, he was calling the police. The threat was so over the top, so dramatic, that I almost laughed. But he had his phone out and was clearly serious. So I left. The whole interaction happened in front of several of his neighbors, which was mortifying. That's when I started reaching out to our mutual friends. Surely once I explained what had really happened, they'd see how unreasonably Tun was behaving. Yes, I'd made some mistakes, but everyone makes mistakes. The whole point of being in a committed relationship is working through problems together, not just bailing the moment things get complicated. Some of our friends were sympathetic. They agreed that Tun was being harsh, that he should at least be willing to have a conversation about what had happened. But others, particularly his closer friends, seemed to think his response was justified. A few people actually told me that they thought I should have expected this kind of reaction, which was incredibly frustrating. Since when was having a friendship with a coworker grounds for having your entire life blown up? 3 weeks after the breakup, my dad called Tun directly. My parents had spent thousands of dollars on wedding preparations, and my dad was not the kind of man who just wrote off that kind of money without a fight. "You humiliated my daughter." "Tun," I heard him say when I was sitting next to him during the call. "We've spent thousands of dollars on this wedding, and you're gonna make this right." Tun's response was calm but firm. "Your daughter cheated on me, Richard. That's why the wedding is off." My dad threatened to sue him for the wedding expenses, which I thought was brilliant. $18,000 was a lot of money, and if Tun wanted to be stubborn about this, then maybe financial pressure would help him see reason. But Tun didn't cave the way we'd expected. Instead, he hired a lawyer through some contact at the university, and 2 months later, our lawsuit was dismissed. Apparently, infidelity was considered adequate grounds for calling off a wedding, even if it meant forfeiting deposits and cancellation fees. The whole legal process ended up costing both sides money and accomplished nothing except making the situation even more hostile. 6 months after the breakup, I ran into Tun at a bar downtown. He was with some coworker, and they were clearly having a great time. He looked good, better than he had in the months leading up to our wedding. Actually, more relaxed, more confident. When he saw me, he nodded politely but didn't come over to talk. And after a few minutes, he and his friend left. Seeing him looking so unaffected by everything that had happened was infuriating. Here I was, still dealing with the fallout from our relationship ending, and he seemed to have moved on completely. That encounter convinced me that maybe enough time had passed for us to have a real conversation about what had happened. Maybe now that the initial hurt and anger had faded, we could talk through things rationally and see if there was any possibility of working things out. A year after our breakup, I found out where he was living and went to his new place. I'd prepared this whole speech about how sorry I was for the mistakes I'd made, how much I'd learned about myself and about relationships, how I understood now why he'd been so hurt, and how we might be able to rebuild trust between us. But when I knocked on his door and he saw me standing there, he just shook his head and started to close the door. I tried to get the words out quickly, tried to explain that I wasn't there to cause problems, but just to see if we could find some kind of closure or understanding. But he cut me off. "Mia, it's been a year. We're not doing this. Please don't come here again." Then he closed the door, and that was it. No yelling, no dramatic confrontation, just a quiet, final rejection that somehow hurt worse than anything that had happened during the actual breakup. Looking back now, I can see that maybe I could have handled some things differently. Maybe I should have been more upfront about my feelings earlier in our relationship. Maybe I should have insisted that we go to couples counseling instead of just trying to solve our problems on my own. Maybe I should have ended things with Tun before getting involved with Blake, instead of trying to manage both situations simultaneously. But I also think Tun bears some responsibility for what happened. He'd gotten so comfortable in our relationship that he stopped putting in effort. He treated me like I was just going to be there no matter what. Like he didn't need to keep earning my attention and affection. When someone feels invisible in their own relationship, it's natural that they'd be drawn to someone who actually sees them and appreciates them. The thing with Blake ended pretty quickly after everything blew up with Tunia. Apparently, Blake wasn't as interested in a real relationship as he'd been in the excitement of our secret connection. Once there was no secrecy involved, once it was just the two of us trying to build something real, the spark faded pretty fast. He started dating someone else within a few months, which stung more than I'd expected it to. I lost most of our mutual friends in the breakup. A few people stayed neutral, but the majority seemed to think that what I'd done was unforgivable. Even though I'd tried to handle the situation as honestly as I could, Once it became clear that Toon wasn't interested in exploring alternative relationship models, it's been isolating. Honestly, when you're with someone for 5 years, your social lives become completely intertwined. And losing that relationship means losing access to an entire community of people. The financial costs were significant too. Beyond the wedding expenses, there were legal fees, the cost of finding a new place to live, and all the practical complications of separating a life we'd built together. I'd gotten used to splitting expenses with Tunine, and adjusting to managing everything on my own was harder than I'd anticipated. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd approached the whole situation differently. If I'd been more direct with Toon about feeling disconnected from him. If I'd insisted we work on our relationship instead of looking for fulfillment elsewhere. If I'd been completely honest about my friendship with Blake from the beginning, maybe we could have worked through our problems. Maybe we could have found a way to recapture what we'd had in the early years. But I also wonder if we were just fundamentally incompatible in ways that would have become apparent eventually. Regardless of how the Blake situation played out, Toon was always going to be the kind of person who was satisfied with quiet stability, and I was always going to need more excitement and passion than that. Maybe it was better that we figured that out before we actually got married and potentially had children together. The hardest part has been accepting that someone I loved and who I thought loved me could just write me off so completely. 5 years together, and he was able to walk away like I meant nothing to him. That level of coldness, that ability to just shut off his feelings, makes me wonder if I ever really knew him at all. The Ton I fell in love with was warm and caring and forgiving. The man who packed my belongings and threatened to call the police was a stranger. I've tried to move forward, to build a new life that doesn't revolve around the relationship I lost. Some days are better than others. I've started therapy, which has helped me understand some of the patterns that led to the choices I made. I've tried dating other people, though it's hard not to compare every new person to what Toon and I had. At least in the beginning, when things were good between us. What I keep coming back to is this sense that we threw away something that could have been salvaged. Relationships take work, and they go through difficult periods. But that doesn't mean you just give up the moment things get complicated. I made mistakes, but I was willing to acknowledge them and work on them. Ton's unwillingness to even try to work through our problems feels like the bigger betrayal. Honestly, when you promise to build a life with someone, you're supposed to fight for that life. Even when it gets messy, I still think about him sometimes. Wonder how he's doing. Wonder if he ever thinks about me or regrets how everything ended. But I've learned not to check his social media. Not to ask mutual acquaintances about him. Not to drive by places we used to go together. That way lies madness. And I've spent enough time being miserable about this situation. The relationship taught me a lot about what I need from a partner and what I'm willing to give in return. I know now that I need someone who stays engaged and present. Someone who doesn't take me for granted just because we've been together for a while. I also know that I need to be more direct about my needs and concerns instead of trying to solve problems by looking outside the relationship. Whether Ton and I could have made it work long term if things had gone differently, I'll never know. But I do know that the way it ended, with such finality and coldness, wasn't what either of us deserved after everything we'd shared together. We both could have been better to each other, and we both could have handled our problems with more maturity and compassion. That's a regret I'll probably carry with me for a long time.